The most counterintuitive truth about avoidant attachment is that their inevitable departure from relationships often represents the deepest expression of love they are capable of experiencing. This paradox lies at the heart of understanding avoidant psychology, where the intensity of their feelings directly correlates with their compulsion to escape before those feelings can threaten their psychological safety. When an avoidant partner begins to feel genuine love, attachment, and emotional dependency, their nervous system interprets these experiences as existential threats that must be neutralized through immediate withdrawal. Their leaving does not indicate lack of love, but rather represents their desperate attempt to preserve themselves from the overwhelming vulnerability that accompanies authentic emotional connection. The love-fear paradox in avoidant psychology. Avoidant individuals experience a fundamental psychological contradiction where their capacity for love directly threatens their sense of safety and autonomy. This paradox creates internal conflicts that become more intense as relationships deepen, eventually reaching crisis points where their attachment system demands escape to preserve psychological integrity. The deeper their emotional connection becomes, the more dangerous the relationship feels to their unconscious mind, creating an inverse relationship between love intensity and relationship sustainability. The avoidance love-fear paradox stems from early developmental experiences where love and emotional connection were associated with pain, abandonment, or loss of autonomy. Their nervous system learned to interpret emotional attachment as a precursor to inevitable hurt, creating automatic responses that equate deep feeling with imminent danger. This conditioning means that the experience of falling in love triggers the same physiological responses as facing physical threats, making romantic attachment feel literally life-threatening. Their paradoxical relationship with love manifests through increasing anxiety and discomfort as emotional intimacy deepens. While they may consciously enjoy the connection and satisfaction provided by close relationships, their unconscious mind begins activating stress responses that make continued closeness feel unbearable. This creates the classic avoidant pattern where they pursue connection until it becomes meaningful, then flee before it can threaten their psychological defenses. The intensity of their love often correlates directly with the urgency of their departure impulses. Relationships that matter less to them feel safer and more sustainable, while connections that touch their deepest emotional needs trigger their strongest avoidance responses. This means their most significant relationships become the least sustainable, creating tragic patterns where they consistently abandon their most meaningful connections. Their love-fear paradox also creates internal shame cycles where they recognize their pattern of leaving people they care about but feel powerless to change their responses. This shame compounds their avoidance tendencies by making them feel unworthy of the love they desperately crave, while confirming their unconscious beliefs about the danger of emotional attachment. The physiological architecture of avoidant departure. The avoidance compulsion to leave loving relationships operates through sophisticated physiological mechanisms that override conscious intentions and rational decision-making. These biological responses represent their nervous system's attempt to protect them from perceived threats to their survival, making departure feel like a biological imperative rather than an emotional choice. Their physiological architecture begins with hyperactivation of their sympathetic nervous system. When emotional intimacy reaches critical thresholds, the same biological systems designed to protect them from physical danger become activated by emotional closeness, creating fight-or-flight responses that make staying in the relationship feel physiologically impossible. Their heart rate increases, stress hormones flood their system, and their body prepares for escape as if facing mortal danger. The avoidance nervous system dysregulation manifests through chronic hypervigilance that intensifies as relationships deepen. They begin scanning for threats, signs of engulfment, or evidence that their autonomy is being compromised. This hypervigilance creates exhaustion and anxiety that makes the relationship feel burdensome rather than nurturing, compelling them toward departure as the only path to nervous system regulation. Their physiological responses include dissociation mechanisms that create emotional numbing when attachment feelings become too intense. This dissociation serves as an emergency brake on their emotional system, creating psychological distance that makes departure feel logical rather than devastating. They may suddenly feel disconnected from their partner and their relationship, as if observing from outside rather than participating authentically. The avoidance biological departure preparation includes stress hormone cascades that create urgency around escape planning. Cortisol and adrenaline responses make them feel as though immediate action is required to preserve their safety, overriding their conscious understanding that the relationship poses no actual threat. This biochemical urgency makes their departure feel inevitable rather than chosen. The emotional overwhelm mechanism. Avoidant individuals possess limited capacity for processing intense emotions, making the depth of feeling that accompanies genuine love relationships overwhelming to their psychological systems. This emotional overwhelm creates internal pressure that can only be relieved through distance and disconnection, making departure feel like emotional survival rather than relationship choice. Their emotional overwhelm begins with their underdeveloped capacity for emotional regulation and processing. Years of suppressing feelings and avoiding emotional intensity leave them without adequate skills for managing the powerful emotions that emerge in loving relationships. When these feelings reach critical mass, their only coping mechanism involves creating distance until the emotional intensity subsides. The avoidance overwhelm mechanism includes identity fusion fears, where deep emotional connection threatens their sense of individual selfhood. They experience loving relationships as potential psychological absorption, where they might lose themselves in their partner's emotional world. This fusion anxiety triggers desperate attempts to reassert their independence through departure before their identity becomes compromised. Their emotional overwhelm extends to feeling responsible for their partner's emotional well-being in ways that feel burdensome and threatening. As emotional intimacy increases, they begin experiencing their partner's emotions as their own responsibility, creating pressure and obligation that conflicts with their need for autonomy. This emotional responsibility feels like imprisonment rather than connection, driving them toward escape. The avoidance overwhelm also involves future anxiety, where they project their current emotional intensity into an unsustainable future of increasing obligation and decreasing freedom. They imagine themselves becoming trapped in emotional dependency that will eventually destroy their autonomy, making present departure feel preferable to future enslavement. The attachment activation terror. When avoidants begin experiencing genuine attachment to their partners, their psychological system interprets this bonding as activation of the very mechanisms that cause their original developmental trauma. This attachment activation creates terror responses that make continued connection feel dangerous to their core psychological integrity. Their attachment activation terror stems from unconscious memories of early relationships where emotional dependency led to abandonment, rejection, or emotional engulfment. When current relationships begin activating similar attachment feelings, their unconscious mind assumes that similar outcomes are inevitable, triggering protective responses designed to prevent re-traumatization. The avoidance terror mechanism includes fear of losing themselves in emotional dependency that mirrors early experiences of having their autonomy compromised by caregivers' emotional needs. They unconsciously equate adult attachment with childhood helplessness, making mature emotional interdependence feel like regression to vulnerable states they cannot tolerate. Their attachment terror extends to abandonment anxiety, where loving someone deeply makes the possibility of loss feel unbearable. Rather than risk experiencing the devastation of abandonment, they choose preemptive departure that allows them to maintain control over the relationship's ending. This gives them the illusion of protection from abandonment while guaranteeing the very outcome they fear. The avoidance activation terror also involves engulfment fears, where emotional closeness feels like psychological suffocation. They experience their partner's love and emotional needs as demands that will eventually consume their individual identity, making departure feel like escape from psychological death rather than rejection of love. The control through departure strategy. Avoidants use departure as their primary strategy for maintaining control over relationships and their emotional experience within them. This control mechanism allows them to regulate emotional intensity, prevent abandonment by others, and preserve their sense of autonomy when relationships become too threatening to their psychological defenses. Their control strategy begins with timing manipulation, where they orchestrate departures before relationships reach points where leaving becomes more difficult or costly. They develop acute sensitivity to relationship milestones that indicate increasing commitment or emotional investment, using this awareness to exit before their options become limited. The avoidance departure control includes emotional regulation through distance, where they manage overwhelming feelings by creating physical and emotional space. This regulation strategy makes departure feel like emotional first aid rather than relationship destruction, allowing them to preserve both the relationship potential and their psychological stability through strategic withdrawal. Their control mechanism extends to preventing their partners from having departure power by leaving first whenever abandonment risks increase. This preemptive striking protects them from experiencing rejection while maintaining their sense of agency over relationship outcomes. They would rather hurt their partners than risk being hurt themselves. The avoidance departure strategy also involves testing their partner's attachment through withdrawal to determine whether the relationship is safe for continued investment. They monitor their partner's responses to their pulling away, using this information to decide whether the relationship represents genuine threat or acceptable risk for future emotional investment. The love expression through withdrawal. Paradoxically, avoidant departure often represents their most authentic expression of love because it demonstrates the profound impact their partner has had on their emotional world. Their withdrawal indicates that the relationship has activated feelings powerful enough to threaten their carefully constructed psychological defenses. Their love expression through withdrawal begins with the recognition that their departure decision involves significant personal cost and emotional pain. They are not leaving because they feel nothing, but because they feel too much. The intensity of their struggle with departure reveals the depth of their emotional investment in ways that their limited emotional vocabulary cannot communicate directly. The avoidance withdrawal demonstrates love through the preservation impulse, where they attempt to protect both themselves and their partner from the inevitable damage they believe their emotional limitations will cause. They unconsciously recognize their inability to provide sustained emotional intimacy and choose departure as a gift that frees their partner to find more emotionally available connection. Their departure expresses love through the sacrifice of their own happiness for what they perceive as their partner's long-term benefit. While this sacrifice is misguided and often unwanted, it represents genuine concern for their partner's well-being and recognition that their emotional limitations create relationship constraints that may ultimately cause more pain than their departure. The avoidance withdrawal also demonstrates love through the courage required to leave relationships that provide them with unprecedented happiness and connection. Their departure decision often involves choosing emotional safety over personal satisfaction, indicating that their feelings for their partner have become powerful enough to override their natural pursuit of pleasure and connection. The unconscious protection mechanism. Avoidant departure operates through unconscious protection mechanisms designed to shield both themselves and their partners from the psychological damage they believe their emotional limitations will inevitably cause. These protection mechanisms operate below conscious awareness, making their departure feel compulsive rather than chosen. Their unconscious protection begins with projected outcome scenarios where they imagine future relationship destruction caused by their emotional unavailability and attachment limitations. Rather than risk inflicting this imagined damage on someone they love, they choose present departure that preserves positive memories while preventing future disappointment and pain. The avoidance protection mechanism includes self-sacrifice impulses where they endure the pain of departure to spare their partner the greater pain of long-term emotional deprivation. They unconsciously recognize their inability to provide sustained emotional intimacy and choose to suffer the consequences of departure rather than subjecting their partner to chronic emotional frustration. Their protection strategy extends to preventing their partner from developing deeper attachment that would make future abandonment more devastating. They recognize unconsciously that their attachment limitations make eventual departure likely, and they choose earlier departure when emotional investment remains manageable rather than later departure when attachment has deepened. The avoidance unconscious protection also involves preserving their partner's capacity for future love by leaving before their emotional limitations can damage their partner's ability to trust and attach. They intuitively understand that staying despite their limitations might create attachment trauma that affects their partner's future relationship capacity. The intimacy threshold breaking point. Every avoidant individual has specific intimacy thresholds that trigger their departure mechanisms when exceeded. Understanding these breaking points reveals how their nervous system monitors relationship intensity and activates escape responses when emotional connection reaches dangerous levels for their psychological functioning. Their intimacy threshold includes emotional vulnerability levels, where sharing deeper feelings or receiving their partner's emotional disclosure creates overwhelming anxiety that demands relief through distance. These thresholds often involve specific emotional topics, relationship conversations, or intimate moments that trigger their flight responses. The avoidance breaking point encompasses physical intimacy intensification, where increased sexual connection or physical affection activates attachment systems they cannot tolerate. Physical closeness often serves as a gateway to emotional intimacy that their nervous system interprets as threatening, making sexual satisfaction a precursor to departure rather than bonding. Their threshold includes future planning discussions, where conversations about shared goals, relationship progression, or commitment expectations trigger panic responses about loss of autonomy and freedom. These planning conversations make abstract relationship concepts feel concrete and threatening, activating immediate departure impulses. The avoidance breaking point also involves emotional responsibility moments where their partner's emotional needs or crises create pressure for emotional support that feels overwhelming and threatening. Situations requiring sustained emotional availability often exceed their capacity and trigger escape responses to avoid psychological overwhelm. The departure timing patterns. Avoidant departure follows predictable timing patterns that reflect their unconscious monitoring of relationship intensity and threat levels. Understanding these patterns reveals how they manage their emotional exposure while maintaining some access to connection and intimacy. Their departure timing includes honeymoon period endings, where initial relationship satisfaction gives way to deeper emotional investment that triggers their avoidance responses. They often leave just as relationships transition from exciting novelty to meaningful emotional connection, avoiding the attachment deepening that makes departure more difficult. The avoidance timing patterns encompass milestone approach responses, where impending relationship markers like exclusivity, meeting family, moving in together, or marriage discussions trigger preemptive departure before these commitments become binding. They monitor relationship progression and exit before reaching points of no return. Their departure timing includes emotional peak moments where particularly meaningful experiences, declarations of love, or relationship satisfaction highs trigger immediate withdrawal responses. These peak experiences often represent the exact moments when their attachment system activates most powerfully, creating urgent departure impulses. The avoidance timing patterns also involve external stress correlation, where life pressures, career demands, or family issues create additional emotional burden that makes relationship maintenance feel impossible. They often use external stresses as justification for departure while protecting themselves from acknowledging their attachment fears. The post-departure emotional experience. After leaving relationships they genuinely love, avoidants experience complex emotional responses that reveal the true cost of their protective strategies. Understanding their post-departure experience illuminates the genuine pain their leaving causes them, while explaining why they continue patterns that create their own suffering. Their post-departure experience begins with immediate relief from the anxiety and overwhelm that drove their departure decision. This relief validates their choice, while masking the deeper emotional consequences that emerge as their nervous system regulation is restored, and they can process what they have lost. The avoidance emotional experience includes delayed grief responses, where the full impact of their loss becomes apparent only after their anxiety subsides. They may experience profound sadness, regret, and longing that contradicts their departure decision while confirming the depth of their feelings for their lost partner. Their post-departure processing involves identity confusion, where they struggle to understand why they consistently leave relationships that provide them with happiness and fulfillment. This confusion creates internal conflict between their conscious desires for connection and their unconscious compulsions toward autonomy and safety. The avoidance emotional experience also includes relationship idealization, where distance allows them to appreciate what they lost without the anxiety that drove their departure. This idealization can create powerful urges to return, while their unchanged psychological patterns make reconciliation unlikely to succeed without significant therapeutic intervention. The cyclical return impulses. Many avoidants experience strong impulses to return to relationships they have left, creating cyclical patterns of departure and attempted reconciliation that reflect their ongoing internal conflict between attachment needs and autonomy fears. Understanding these return impulses reveals the genuine love that motivates their departure, while explaining why reunion rarely resolves their underlying attachment conflicts. Their return impulses begin with romanticized memory formation, where distance eliminates the anxiety and overwhelm that drove their departure, while preserving positive relationship memories. This selective memory makes the lost relationship appear perfect, while minimizing the emotional intensity that made departure feel necessary. The avoidance return patterns include loneliness realization, where solitude allows them to recognize how much meaning and satisfaction their relationship provided. Without the pressure of daily emotional intimacy, they can appreciate their partner's value while temporarily forgetting why the relationship felt threatening. Their return impulses extend to comparison disappointment, where subsequent relationships fail to provide the depth of connection they experienced with departed partners. These comparisons can create powerful motivation for return, while their unchanged attachment patterns make successful reconciliation unlikely without addressing underlying fears. The avoidance cyclical patterns also involve testing behaviors, where they attempt limited contact or reconciliation to determine whether their feelings and fears have changed. These testing behaviors often provide temporary satisfaction while reactivating the same attachment fears that drove their original departure. The true cost of avoidant departure. The avoidance pattern of leaving loving relationships creates profound personal costs that extend far beyond immediate relationship loss. Understanding these costs reveals how their protective strategies ultimately create the very outcomes they fear, while preventing access to the love and connection they desperately need. Their departure costs begin with chronic relationship instability that prevents them from building the sustained emotional connections necessary for psychological healing and growth. Their pattern of leaving ensures they never remain in relationships long enough to work through their attachment fears or develop secure bonding experiences. The avoidance costs include identity isolation, where their departure patterns prevent them from experiencing themselves as lovable and worthy of sustained affection. Without evidence of their capacity to maintain loving relationships, they develop increasingly negative self-concepts that reinforce their belief that departure is inevitable and appropriate. Their departure costs extend to emotional development arrest, where their avoidance of emotional intensity prevents them from developing the emotional regulation and intimacy skills necessary for mature relationships. Each departure represents a missed opportunity for growth and healing that keeps them trapped in adolescent relationship patterns. The avoidance costs also include legacy regret, where they recognize too late the opportunities for love and connection they have sacrificed to their fears. This regret can create profound depression and hopelessness as they realize their protective strategies have prevented them from accessing the very experiences that could have provided healing and fulfillment. Understanding that avoidant departure often represents their deepest expression of love provides crucial insight into their psychological world while explaining the tragic nature of their relationship patterns. Their leaving indicates not absence of feeling, but overwhelming presence of emotions they cannot tolerate or manage. Recognition of this paradox allows for more compassionate understanding of their struggles, while providing clarity about the fundamental incompatibility between their protection strategies and relationship success. Yes,